"Sir, please take my children," the starving mother whispered. The rich cowboy said, "I'll take you too." Texas High Plains, March 1885. Night pressed close against the wide plains, heavy and wet. Rain fell in fine threads, slicking the dirt until it turned to dark clay. The wind moaned low through the grass, wrapping itself around the lonely two-story house like a warning. Inside the barn, Colton Reyes finished tying the last knot on the Mustang's bandage. The horse blew out a breath, shifting its weight, but no longer fighting him. "There," Colton murmured, patting its neck, "you'll live to run another day." He straightened slowly, rolling his shoulders until the ache cracked loose. His back had stiffened from hours bent under dim light and colder air. He hung the lantern on a nail, brushed mud from his palms, and headed across the yard. By the time he reached the porch, his shirt clung to his back, and the rain had started to thin into mist. Inside the house greeted him with silence, the kind that filled every corner and creaked in the boards. He stripped off his wet coat, hung it near the stove, and poured a little water from the kettle into a bowl. The heat loosened the chill from his fingers. He meant to clean up, maybe pour a bit of whiskey, rub liniment into his sore shoulders before bed. The firelight flickered over the room, the old leather chair, the rifle leaning by the door, the framed photograph of a woman long gone. Colton paused, staring at it just long enough to feel the old ache surface and fade again. He loosened his collar, rolled his neck once more, then reached for the small tin of liniment on the table. The smell of camphor filled the air as he rubbed it into his shoulder, working the muscle with slow, steady pressure. Then 3 knocks, faint, quick, then silence. He froze, his hand still on his shoulder. The clock ticked once, twice. He waited, thinking it might have been the wind. Then came another series, soft but urgent, muffled by the storm. Colton set down the tin, grabbed the oil lamp, and crossed the floor. The flame wavered in his grip as he opened the door. A gust of cold air rushed in. Under the swaying lantern light stood a woman, thin, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face. In her arms an infant lay wrapped in a faded quilt, still and silent except for a weak, rasping breath. Behind her, 3 children clung together. A girl, maybe 8, with a jaw set too firm for her age, held the hands of 2 small boys, twins, trembling in the rain. Their clothes were soaked rags, bare feet pressed into the mud. The woman's lips were blue, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Sir, please take my children." Her words cracked on the last syllable, nearly lost to the wind. Colton didn't move. He saw the exhaustion, the terror, the last threat of hope in her eyes. And for a moment, he was a boy again, watching his own mother beg the world for mercy it refused to give. The girl squeezed her brother's hands tighter. The infant whimpered once, then fell quiet. The woman's legs gave way. Colton stepped forward, catching her by the elbow before she fell. Rain rolled off the brim of his hat, dripping between them. He looked down into her face, pale and drawn, then past her to the children, silent as ghosts in the dark. His voice came low, steady and sure. "I'll take you too." The door closed with a solid thud behind them, shutting out the wind and rain like a slammed chapter. Colton stepped aside to let the group enter. The woman hesitated just past the threshold, her arms still tight around the infant. The older girl glanced at Colton once, then gently tugged her brothers over the worn floorboards. He led them through the entryway into the main room, wide and high ceiling with heavy beams overhead and thick walls that kept the worst of the weather out. Though sparsely decorated, everything was well-built and cared for, the kind of place money had shaped. Sturdy furniture, thick curtains, clean rugs, but lived in by a man who had no one to share it with. The fireplace sat at the far end of the room, embers still pulsing low in the stone hearth. A single oil lamp on the table cast long shadows, its glow dancing against shelves lined with old books, riding gear, and framed photographs no one ever asked about. The air held a mix of cedar wood, iron stove heat, and the faint, clean scent of saddle soap, masculine and quiet, like the man himself. Colton moved to the hearth and stoked the fire until flames reached higher, licking at the dry logs. Warmth crept slowly into the room. He turned back and gestured toward the nearby bench. "Sit, get close to the fire," he said, voice rough but not unkind. The girl obeyed first. She guided her little brothers to the stone hearth and knelt down, pulling them close. Their bare feet hovered inches above the warmth, faces turning toward it like flowers to sun. One of the twins coughed, a dry, hoarse sound. The woman, Maggie, lowered herself carefully onto the wooden bench, arms still cradling the baby. Her shoulders shook, but she did not make a sound. The child's breathing was faint, her face barely visible under the damp folds of quilt. Colton crossed to the stove and lit a second lamp. The light bloomed gently, revealing more of the room, shelves of canned goods, thick wool blankets folded near the door, and a closed door leading to the washroom beyond. Without a word, he filled a kettle and set it on the stove, then rummaged through a drawer until he found a tin of honey and a bundle of dried oats. From the cupboard, he took down mugs and a chipped bowl, then knelt beside a cupboard trunk to pull out spare clothes, small ones, from a box labeled in faded ink, Carter's old things. The boys were shivering. He set down the bundle of clothes, then took a rag, dipped it in warm water from the kettle, and began gently wiping their muddy faces and hands. Their skin was cold to the touch, feet raw with blisters. He said nothing, just moved quietly, cleaning, dressing, wrapping soft cloth around their sore heels. The girl, Lucy, did not move. She watched him, unblinking, her small hands resting protectively on her brothers' backs. She refused the mug of honeyed water he offered, instead pressing it into Jessia's hands. Meanwhile, Maggie rocked the baby, whose breaths came in shallow flutters. Colton fetched an old fleece, his mother's, worn but clean, and carefully draped it over the infant. Then he stepped away and returned with a basket from under the sewing table, lined with flannel. It made a crude cradle, but it would do. He placed it beside Maggie. The twins curled up next to the fire, heads resting on each other's shoulders. Lucy began feeding them spoonfuls of the warm oats Colton had stirred together. The girl ate nothing herself. Near the hearth, Colton crouched down with a small pair of scuffed leather shoes. He turned them over in his hands, pulled a needle from the kit beside him, and began stitching the sole back into place. His fingers were strong, deliberate, each pulled tight and precise. From the bench, Maggie watched him. Her face was pale, eyes sunken from exhaustion, but they followed every motion. The firelight catching on her lashes, flickering across the shadowed curve of her jaw. She said nothing, but in the long silence, her gaze said it all. The days passed slowly at first, then faster, as though the house had finally remembered how to breathe. Mornings began with the smell of cornbread and firewood. Lucy stood on a wooden crate by the sink, her sleeves rolled up, clumsily washing tin plates under Maggie's watchful eye. She would glance up now and then, waiting for a nod of approval. Maggie gave it quietly, her hands moving over dough, her body no longer just surviving, but starting to belong. Outside, Caleb and Jesse transformed the muddy yard into a battlefield. With sticks for rifles and ropes as lassos, they played out dusty duels and daring escapes. Their laughter, once foreign to these walls, now echoed through the house like music. One morning, Colton dragged an old wooden gate from behind the barn. By sundown, He had nailed it to the corner of the abandoned goat shed, propped up 2 crates inside, and painted sheriffs in crooked black letters above the door. "For the twins," he said, handing them each a tin badge. "They're both in charge," Maggie asked, raising a brow. Colton gave a rare half-smile. God help this town. Later that week, Lucy sat with Colton on the porch, peeling apples in silence. "Did you ever have children?" she asked, voice flat but curious. Colton looked out at the horizon. "I did, then I lost him." He didn't say more. She didn't ask. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Lucy tiptoed into the kitchen and left a small wedge of sweet cornbread wrapped in cloth on Colton's table. Maggie began singing again. Sometimes in the late afternoons when the house was quiet and the wind soft, she would sit by the fireplace with Rosie tucked in her arms and hum old lullabies from her childhood in Georgia. Her voice was rough in places, but steady, soothing. Colton never entered the room when she sang. He stayed on the porch, leaning against the beam, listening with his hat pulled low. He did not know the words, but the sound rooted something deep inside him, something that had not moved in years. One morning, they carried buckets to the well together. The sun was just beginning to burn off the mist. Maggie reached for the rope at the same time Colton did. Their hands touched, his callous, hers small and warm. Neither spoke, neither moved away. In the shade of the barn later, Maggie sat cross-legged, mending a tear in Caleb's only shirt. Colton leaned in the doorway, watching her. She felt his gaze, looked up, but did not stop sewing. For the first time since she lost everything, she did not feel pied. She felt seen. Then came the night the rain returned. It started with a cough from Rosie. By midnight, the baby was wheezing, her tiny chest rising too fast, lips tinged purple. Maggie held her close, rocking, whispering, praying. Panic clawed at her throat. Colton entered the room, saw the baby's labored breaths, and said nothing. He grabbed his coat, wrapped Rosie in Maggie's shawl, and lifted the child with quiet urgency. "Stay warm," he said. He mounted his horse in the pouring rain and rode 8 miles. Maggie stood by the window for hours, soaked in fear. At dawn, the door opened. Colton was soaked through shivering mud on his boots, but in his arms Rosie stirred, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Her breathing was clear again. Her fever had broken. He handed her back, wordless. Maggie collapsed into his chest, her arms around both him and the baby, and wept for the first time in years. "You saved my child," she whispered, trembling. Colton did not speak, but in that moment, something between them changed quietly, irreversibly. Rumors swirled like the spring winds that swept through Hollow Creek, cutting, sharp, and full of spite. "They say the Cowboy's hiding a widow for company," muttered a man outside the general store. Others chuckled, their glances shaded in judgment. The words trickled down to the children. When Lucy walked beside Colton into town, her hands gripping the market basket. Boys sneered, "Beggar girl." Caleb and Jesse were shoved by older kids near the well, teased for their patched clothes and quiet eyes. Even adults looked through them, not at them. Then came the silence of trade. 2 merchants refused to buy hay from Colton's ranch, mumbling about new orders from the council. A cattle broker canceled an appointment without reason. The message was clear. Association with Maggie and her children carried a cost, and the cost was about to rise. Late afternoon, the air was hot, dry, and dust from the roads curled like smoke. A black carriage rattled down the path toward the Ray's ranch, its paint gleaming, pulled by 2 perfectly groomed horses. The carriage stopped just outside the fence. Colton was stacking feed by the barn when he heard the wheels. He turned slowly, dropped the sack onto the ground, and wiped his hands. Ezekiel Gallows stepped down, tall, rail-thin. with a long black coat and a hat that shaded his sharp eyes. Two men flanked him, both younger, both silent. Their boots crushed dry earth as they approached. Colton stood still, arms crossed. He said nothing. Gallows offered no pleasantries. I came because of the town's reputation and because of what people are saying. Colton didn't move. People say plenty, especially when they have nothing better to do. Gallows continued unfazed. A woman with no record. 4 children living under the roof of the most visible ranch in the county. Some see kindness, others see scandal. Either way, they talk. Maggie appeared in the doorway, baby Rosie in her arms. Her face was calm, but her grip on the child was firm. Lucy stood behind the curtain, watching without blinking. Gallows shifted his eyes toward Maggie. No one doubts your intentions, Mr. Rays, but intentions don't keep order. There are places for women like her, places where children can be raised with proper schooling and rules. Colton's arms tightened across his chest. You mean an orphanage. I mean structure, discipline, appearances, the kind this town depends on. You of all people know, Mr. Rays, your ranch survives on water rights granted by the council, and water-like order flows only when channels stay clear. Colton's jaw clenched. His voice when it came was low and hard. You want to rip a 3-year-old from her mother's arms and call it progress. Gallows didn't blink. I call it preservation. Without another word, he turned, climbed back into the carriage, and closed the door. Before it rolled away, he leaned out the window once more. Summer's coming, Mr. Rays, and water doesn't always flow where you want it to. The carriage vanished in a trail of dust. Maggie stood frozen. Colton walked to her side and rested his hand gently on her shoulder. If image is all they care about, he said quietly, then let them watch me choose people over power. That night, Maggie folded blankets near the fire, her movement stiff. She glanced at Colton across the room. I can leave, she said, before they take everything from you. Colton stood, turned toward the door where one of the council's men had returned to speak again. I can't watch another child be taken from their mother, he said loud enough for them all to hear. You want them, step over my body. 2 days later, the water was cut. The stream that once ran through the east field dried to cracked stone. The vegetable patch shriveled under the sun. Cattle drank slower. The hired hands left one by one. A land investor withdrew his offer to purchase the neighboring tract. Colton said nothing. One morning he stood in the middle of the dried-out pasture, boots sinking into soft, hot dust. Sun bore down, unrelenting. He looked out over the land that had once thrived. He spoke softly to no one and everyone. Some men choose to save the land. I choose to save the people behind him. Maggie stepped forward. Her hand slid into his. Her voice trembled, but her grip was sure. Then I will not let you fight alone. The heat came like a punishment. By late June, the sun had bleached the hills pale and cracked the earth beneath Colton's boots. The once green pasture was now a brittle wasteland, dotted with thirsty cattle and abandoned tools. The creek bed had turned to bone-dry stone, and the wind carried more dust than breeze. The garden Maggie had tended with Lucy's help shriveled within a week. Tomato vines browned, lettuce wilted in place. The water barrels stood nearly empty. The town's pressure tightened like a noose. Colton's license to distribute hay and grain was quietly suspended. No one came to buy feed. No one answered his letters. A man with land, livestock, and pride, but with no way to sell or water them. He sat at the kitchen table one evening, staring at a ledger book that told the truth, plain and cruel. Across from him, Maggie reached into a worn cloth pouch. She pulled out a small gold ring, simple, dulled by time, but still whole. My husband gave me this the day we buried our first child, she said, her voice even. I kept it all this time, but we could sell it. It might buy us enough supplies to start digging or feed to keep the cattle alive another week. Colton looked at the ring, then up at her. No, Colton, I will not let you give that up. It is just a ring. It is your memory, your past, and you think I give it up because I forget, she said, her voice tightening. I do not let go because I want to erase it. I let go because I am choosing something else now. I am choosing what comes next. He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached across the table, closed her fingers gently over the ring, and nodded. That night they made a plan. The next morning, Colton marked out a spot near the southern edge of the property, an old spring his grandfather once spoke of. They would dig a new well by hand if they had to. The ground was hard as iron, but it was the only way. He swung the first pick. Then Maggie, then Lucy, barefoot but fierce, brought a pail of water to cool their hands. Caleb and Jesse followed, dragging shovels too big for them. They carved into the earth together. Layer by layer, Maggie mended tools, kept the children fed, and learned the rhythm of the land. She wasn't raised to break soil, but she did with blistered hands and a straight spine. Each day, Colton would look at her across the field, dirt on her face, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, and something unspoken moved behind his ribs. One scorching afternoon, Maggie crossed the field with a damp cloth. Colton was bent over the trench, shirt soaked through. She reached up, wiped the sweat from his brow without a word. Their eyes met. They stood still, heat between them hotter than the sun overhead, hearts louder than the crickets. But neither spoke, not yet. There was work to do. Hunger to outlast, a fight to keep fighting, but in the thick air of that endless summer, something had shifted, not just in the land but in them. It came without warning. The sky, bruised purple for hours, finally cracked open in the late evening. At first, it was just a whisper on the wind. Then the first drop fell and another, and suddenly the heavens poured as if the land had finally been forgiven. Colton stepped onto the porch, hat in hand, letting the rain soak his shirt. He watched in stillness as the dry earth darkened, as the dust flattened, as life kissed the ground again. Behind him, the door flung open, laughter burst out like sunlight. Lucy screamed with joy, dragging Caleb and Jesse into the downpour. They danced barefoot in the yard, their clothes clinging to thin frames, arms stretched toward the clouds. Jesse slipped and fell, but laughed harder for it. Caleb made a game of catching raindrops in his mouth. Even Rosie clutched tight in Maggie's arms, waved her tiny fists at the sky as if blessing the storm. Maggie stood at the doorway, unmoving. Her lips trembled, then her shoulders. Then, quietly, she crumbled. Tears spilled down her cheeks, lost in the rain. Colton stepped forward without a word. He shrugged off his coat and gently draped it over her shoulders. His fingers lingered for a second too long on the collar. Her eyes met his, startled, soft, searching. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded but said nothing. Her throat was too full. The rain fell steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something older than grief. Later that night, when the house had dried, when the children were tucked under patchwork quilts, and the fire hummed low, Maggie found Colton outside. He stood under the porch beam, one hand on the post, the other holding a cup of black coffee gone cold. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the kind that hushed everything. She walked up beside him, arms folded under his coat. "I thought I'd never hear rain again," she said quietly. Colton nodded. "I started building fences in my head, preparing to lose it all." "Why didn't you give up?" He glanced at her. "Because you didn't." They stood in silence, the only sound, the soft drip from the roof. Then Colton said almost to himself, "I used to think I was meant to be alone, like maybe that's what a man like me deserved." Maggie's voice came softer than the rain. "And I used to think a woman like me wasn't allowed to dream again. That once you're a widow with 4 mouths to feed, your dreams belong to them." He looked at her then fully, deeply, his voice steady, but thick with something he hadn't dared name. "Maggie, I don't want you to just stay here. I want you to be here. I want you to stay because you choose it, not because you ran out of other places to go." Her breath caught. He wasn't asking. He wasn't begging. He was opening a door she had stopped believing existed. "I know it's not much," he added. "There's no ring yet. No altar, just this porch and these hands and this house that's still learning how to hold joy. Maggie stepped closer. You don't need to ask, she whispered, because I've already answered. He tilted his head, uncertain. We don't need to start over, she said, reaching for his hand. We just keep going. From the moment fate made you open that door. He closed his fingers around hers. The storm passed, but the rain had done its job. And for the first time, Colton Rays didn't just hear hope. He believed in it. The town of Hollow Creek never gave up easily. Just as Colton and Maggie began to rebuild, digging deeper into the earth and into each other, word came from the council office. Their water rights, even if reinstated, remained invalid unless ownership of the land reflected a legal union. The permit was issued to a married couple, said the letter, stamped and cold. Since no such legal union exists, the town reserves the right to revoke water access without notice. Colton read the paper once, then again slower. Maggie stood behind him, her hand lightly on his back. They're trying to push us, he muttered. They're trying to break us, Maggie corrected, but neither flinched. That night, sitting on the edge of their shared bed with Rosie asleep in a cradle and the boys snoring softly in the next room, Colton turned. Maggie, I don't want to get married because they said so, he said. She met his eyes unshaken. Then, let's do it for the ones watching us. He looked to the door where Lucy had scrolled each sibling's name in pencil along the frame, their height marks like rings in a tree. Proof of growth for them, he said. Word spread fast. Within days, plans were drawn for a small ceremony. Nothing grand, nothing fancy, just vows, just truth, just enough to stand before the law and before the children. It was Maggie who chose the chapel. The old whitewashed building near the town square hadn't seen a wedding in years. Its bell was rusted, its pews dusty, but it stood upright like her. Lucy hemmed a dress from one of Colton's old curtains, white, delicate, with lace patterns only visible in sunlight. She borrowed thread from the preacher's wife and added blue ribbon around the waist. I want her to feel like a bride, Lucy whispered, pressing the fabric one last time. Colton wore his only suit jacket, freshly brushed, and boots scuffed but polished with oil. The morning of the ceremony, a small cart pulled up outside their house. A sack of flour, a pie wrapped in a checked cloth, a jar of wild flowers, each without a name. Even the grocer, who once looked away, now tipped his hat when Colton passed him on the street. At noon, under a sky clear and vast, Maggie walked down the aisle, her arm linked with Lucy's. Her hair was tied back with a piece of her old apron string, now clean, now proud. Colton waited by the altar, alone but not lonely. The preacher, an aging man with hands that trembled slightly, asked for silence. Colton turned to Maggie, took both her hands, and began without paper or pretense. I do not need a court to validate this, he said, his voice rough but steady. I do not need a signature to know what I've chosen. But today, Maggie Hart, I vow before this land and these eyes, your children's my own, that I will never leave your side. Through flood, drought, judgment, and fear I stay. Maggie's breath hitched and Lucy's hand found hers. The preacher nodded. Do you, Maggie, accept this man? Maggie smiled, not wide, but sure, I do. Not because I need to, because I want to. Because every day since I stepped into his home, I have felt the kind of safety no paper ever gave me. When the kiss came, it was soft, reverent, and real. As they stepped out into the square, church bell ringing above them for the first time in years, people clapped, not all, but enough to mean something. Maggie and Colton stood on the step, hand in hand, the children crowding around their legs. He looked down at her. You know, this doesn't end the fight, he said. She nodded. But it means we fight it together with our name on the same line. He smiled. That line is just ink. What matters is what we've already written in sweat, in soil, in the quiet nights. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the veil slipping back. In a town that once tried to push them apart, they stood united, not just by love but by choice, not just by law but by legacy. 1 year passed. The land that once cracked under a brutal sun now swayed with golden rows of corn. The well Colton and Maggie had dug by hand never ran dry. Water spilled cold and clear into the troughs each morning, and the children no longer woke with dust in their mouths. Maggie stood in the doorway, her hand resting gently on her growing belly. She watched Lucy chase Caleb and Jessie across the field while Rosie toddled after them, a ribbon flapping behind her like a flag of victory. That evening, under the wide branches of an old sycamore, they sat around a long table Colleton had built from salvaged planks. It creaked under the weight of roasted vegetables. Warm bread and laughter. The sky turned the color of ripe peaches as Colton wiped his hands on a cloth and leaned back. Story time, Jessie declared, mouth full of corn. Colton smiled and cleared his throat. Once upon a time, he began, there was a man who lived in a big house. It had high ceilings and strong walls, but his heart was empty. He did not laugh, he did not cry, he just waited for what? Lucy asked. For someone to knock on his door, Colton said. Rosie crawled into his lap, curling like a kitten, and did someone knock? Caleb piped up. Colton looked at Maggie, her cheeks lit soft by the lanterns, strung between the branches. One night, in the middle of a storm, someone did. A woman with a baby in her arms and 3 children at her side. Little Rosie looked up at him, eyes wide. Did he open it? Colton smiled, the kind that lived deep in the eyes. He did not just open the door, sweetheart. He opened his whole heart. Maggie reached across the table, placing her hand over his. It was a quiet touch, but it spoke of every promise they had ever made without words. Behind them, the old wooden house stood strong, its porch repaired, its windows glowing with the soft light of oil lamps. No marble floors, no golden gates, but inside warmth. Inside belonging. As the camera pulls back, if there had been one, it would show the children's giggles echoing through the dusk, the flicker of candles swaying in the wind, and 2 people leaning toward each other. In that soft, sacred way only love allows, a voice low and sure would carry over the fading light. Some folks measure happiness in coins, others in fame. But out here in the West, we measure it different. A patch of land, a patchwork family, and someone who opens the door when your whole life's on the other side of it. The wind rustled the sycamore leaves. The table clinked with shared dishes and laughter. True har, derned and homegrown, rose into the twilight. Not a perfect family, but a complete one. If this story moved something deep in your chest, if Colton and Maggie's journey reminded you that love can grow even in the dustiest corners of life, then do not let it end here. Hit that hype button, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, and join us as we keep riding through tales of grit, heart, and romance that defied the rules of the frontier. Out here, love does not whisper, it echoes, and we are just getting started.